Hello everybody. On behalf of the PHRN, welcome to the launch of a new book called Sharing Linked Data for Health Research Towards Better Decision Making. My name is Felicity Flack and I'm the Manager of Policy and Client Services at the PHRN, and I'm also a co-author on this book. I'm talking to you today from the lands of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the lands we're meeting on today and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'm really excited to introduce you to my co-authors today, Carolyn Adams, a Senior Lecturer from Macquarie University's Law School, and Judy Allen, an Honorary Fellow from the University of Western Australia's Law School. Today, we're each going to give a short presentation, which hopefully will give you a taste of what the book is about. At the end of the three presentations, we'll answer as many questions as we can. If you do have questions and they come to you while we're speaking, please feel free to type them into the Q&A box at any time during the presentation, but we will answer the questions at the end. This webinar is being recorded and we'll email you as soon as it's available on the PHRN YouTube channel. So first up today is Carolyn Adams. She's going to start us off. So welcome, Carolyn, and I can't wait to hear what you've got to say.
Thanks, Felicity. I'll just share my screen. Okay, well, thank you to Felicity and to the Population Health Research Network for hosting this webinar, and welcome to all our participants. It is such a joy to finally see this work in print and be able to introduce it to you. Our book is about sharing linked data for health research. It's part of the Cambridge Bioethics and Law series, which was founded in 2003. This delights me as Alexander McCall Smith was the first editor of the series. When we were in Edinburgh in the early stages of this project in about 2016, I began reading McCall Smith's Sunday Philosophy Club novels, which I very much enjoyed. It's very good to know that there is life after academia. Cambridge University Press described the Bioethics and Law series as focusing on the law's complex and troubled relationship with medicine. In this book, we tackle the law's complex and troubled relationship with sharing and linking data for research. Our aim is to unravel the legal and ethical complexities of sharing linked data for research and to provide a template for a less troubled relationship moving forward. This is important as we're all aware of the increasing importance of population-wide data to public health research. Our focus in this book is on the use of government administrative data from sources such as the Medicare and pharmaceutical benefits data collections, public hospital admission and discharge records, and birth and death registers. Access to these population-wide collections of individual level data is essential to support public health research and to promote good evidence-based policy development. Our focus is also on linked data, as we believe this is the future of population health research. Linkage of population-wide data collections provides research resources that are inclusive, representative, more or less accurate, and cost-effective, as well as being an efficient and effective use of existing data. In her foreword to our book, Professor Fiona Stanley notes that although the information in these data collections relates to individuals, the collections themselves relate to communities and can provide invaluable information about the health and well-being of those communities. Using and sharing these data collections for research, she writes, has unlimited potential to improve the quality of healthcare and to save lives. So clearly, all this personal information is sensitive, and while it can be used in legitimate ways to administer and improve the public health system, it can also be used to profile and unjustly discriminate against individuals and groups. For this reason, the collection, use and sharing of such information, including for research, is highly regulated. Still, there are legitimate concerns in the community about big data and the widespread collection and use of personal information by governments and the private sector. These concerns, if not properly considered and addressed, can have a detrimental impact on the beneficial use of government data collections for health and other research, despite the fact that such research is generally conducted in a highly regulated and privacy protective environment. My co-authors and I all understand the mechanics of data linkage, more or less, probably less in my case, because we've worked with and for the Australian Population Health Research Network in different capacities over the last 10 years or so as staff members, consultants and members of advisory groups. We also understand the risks to privacy, to confidentiality, to the moral, legal and ethical interests of individuals, and critically to the social license needed to support this kind of research. We have decades of collective experience in privacy law and ethical review. In developing this book project, we wanted to explore ways to achieve the benefits of data linkage research while addressing the risks. This book is the result of our efforts to find a way forward that addresses all the identified risks of data linkage research while supporting the use of data for ethical research that is in the public interest. As the subtitle of the book indicates, our focus is also on decision making. Access to government administrative data for research is based on a series of decisions by legislators, data custodians, ethics committees and others who in their decision making seek to balance the risks and benefits associated with the use of this data for research. As an administrative lawyer, I'm very comfortable looking at data making processes to ensure that they're evidence-based, transparent, timely, consistent and fair. Administrative lawyers focus on the decision-making frameworks and the decision-making processes of government. In this book, we've applied this knowledge base to the decision-making processes that unlock access for researchers to a well-guarded and extremely valuable community resource. The genesis of this project lies in our collective experience working with researchers, data custodians, human research ethics committees, and consumer representatives over the past decade or more on managing access to government data collections for research. We heard researchers expressing frustration that they were facing unjustified delays and lack of access to data for research that was clearly in the public interest. Other stakeholders also appeared to be in trouble. Government data custodians are responsible for making decisions on whether to release data for research. We heard directly from data custodians across Australia by way of empirical research that we conducted in 2017, that while recognising the benefits of releasing data for research, they found the process of decision-making difficult because they didn't have sufficient resources or guidance. We heard from ethics committees that they found data linkage projects complex and difficult to assess. We heard from consumer representatives that there were concerns about privacy, transparency, community awareness, and consultation. There was clearly work to do. We took as our brief in this project first to identify the full range of values, interests and rights at stake in the data linkage environment, so that when it came to balancing the risks and benefits, all the relevant issues were on the table. We didn't think all the relevant issues were on the table. And so I'll give you an example from my own field of expertise. As well as an administrative lawyer, I'm also a human rights lawyer with a particular interest in privacy and open government. But even I, when sitting on ethics committees and data linkage advisory committees, began to wonder why privacy seemed to be the only human rights considered by decision makers in this field. Privacy is not the only human right. It gets a lot of press because it's what we call a first generation right, which are those rights formulated in the period of the Enlightenment and seen as essential in liberal democratic societies. These are the rights that feature prominently in bills of rights in liberal democracies around the world, and they include rights such as the right to free speech and assembly, the right to vote, the right to a fair trial, and so on. But rights have moved on. Second generation rights emerged following World War II and relate to substantial equality. These are economic, social, and cultural rights, such things as the right to work, the right to adequate food and housing, and critically, the right to health. Both first and second generation rights are set out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the United Nations has made clear that all rights are indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated. In addition, the right to privacy is not absolute. International human rights law expressly requires that the right to privacy is balanced with the rights and freedoms of others. So where was the right to health in the decision-making processes leading to the collection, use, and sharing of linked data for research? In several chapters of the book, there were chapters dealing with human rights and the legal framework, we demonstrate that the right to privacy is given significantly more legal force and visibility in decision-making arrangements in the 3 jurisdictions under consideration in this book: Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom. These jurisdictions were chosen because they have highly regulated and highly developed data linkage programs. To give one example from Chapter 6, Law, it is our view that opt-out mechanisms for the use of personal information for research are weighted too heavily in favour of privacy and pay insufficient attention to the responsibilities of individuals to respect the rights and freedoms of others, including the right to health. A second example is decision-making criteria that ask decision makers to balance the right to privacy with the benefits of research. In this equation, the right to privacy is heavily weighted because rights carry more legal and moral weight than public interests, such as the benefits of research. If, however, the right to privacy were balanced with the right to health, the scales would be more evenly weighted. Our book is divided into 3 parts, which you can see here. In part 1, the concept of data linkage is explained, along with the risks and benefits of using individual level data for research. The full range of individual, community, and public interests are introduced, and the concept of social license is discussed. In part 2, we look at 3 regulatory frameworks for making decisions about whether linked data can be used for research. So human rights, research ethics, and law. In part 3, we use case studies and examples to investigate how these decision-making frameworks are implemented in Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom. And a spoiler alert, Chapter 8 is where you will find our recommendations for reform, leading to better regulatory frameworks and better decision-making processes. We think this book will be of interest to a wide range of stakeholders, including legislators, policymakers, data custodians, ethics committees, community health advocates, public health academics, and others. While the book does have strong theoretical foundations in research ethics and moral philosophy, we've aimed to develop and present practical solutions to the problems faced by stakeholders in this complex and evolving environment. We've framed our discussion of specialist areas such as human rights, research ethics, and law so that they're accessible to everyone, not just experts in the field. Ultimately, our goal is to ensure that research using linked administrative data develops on sound, ethical, rights-based, and lawful foundations. This approach, in turn, is designed to attract and sustain the social license needed to support the use of government administrative data for the benefit of the community, locally, nationally, and internationally. Now I would like to hand the baton to my colleague Judy Allen from the University of Western Australia, who will focus on our findings in relation to the use of consent and anonymisation models. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn, and good morning or hello to everybody today. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about one of the foundation assumptions that we base our book on, and that's this traditional approach, that the traditional approach of consent or anonymizing the data is no longer fit for the purpose, and that what we should be focusing on more clearly is authorization and approval as a model. So traditionally, we've taken the view that if you seek consent and or de-identify the data, then individual interests will be protected and the use of data will be not only ethical, but lawful. Our argument is that the world has moved on from that approach, that approach is no longer fit for the purpose, and instead has been replaced by the authorization and approval model. So it's that model that we put under the microscope in our book. So stepping back a little bit to the problems with the consent and anonymized model. So consent has always been the lodestar, if you like, of ethical research. If one sought consent for the use of data, then individuals could exercise their autonomy and decide for themselves whether they wanted their information used for the particular research, and decide for themselves whether they wanted to accept the risks of participation. Similarly, if you had consent for the use of the data, then that use was lawful. That approach is problematic in this kind of research using administrative data for linked data for research, for a number of reasons, and these reasons are well canvassed in the literature. So there's the problem with large cohorts. If you've got cohorts of many millions of participants, the practical problems in seeking consent. Importantly, the collection of the data is remote from the usage of the data. It's remote in time, so it's collected generally in the course of service delivery, in hospitals, by health carers, in schools, in the provision of social security, and so on. And at that time, the research use is unknown. The users are unknown and the uses are unknown. So you can't realistically seek a real consent at that stage. Even if consent is sought at a later date, then you still have the problems of the complexity of the information. Barakos and Nussbaum have described this as the transparency paradox. So it's a pull. On one side, you're being pulled to provide simpler, clearer information. On the other side, you're being pulled to provide more detailed information, which people need to make real decisions. And that becomes an impossible paradox. And then there's the frequency of use. So administrative data is constantly used. And so the requests for consent would become unrealistically burdensome for individuals. So consent is problematic in this context. It's still important where there's a direct relationship between the researchers and the participants, but that's the minority of data linkage research projects. So for most of these projects, consent is not in the picture. So then you turn to anonymizing the data. And this too has its problems. So traditionally, it was felt that if you could de-identify the data, then the participants would be protected from the risks. And more than that, the information was in a sense disconnected from the person. So the ethical issues somehow went away. That was the traditional view. So much so that in some places still in the world, if data is categorized as de-identified, then no ethical review is required. We think that's a big problem. On the legal side, if you de-identified the data, then the law simply doesn't apply. So the privacy regime, the confidentiality law doesn't apply to de-identified data. But there's a number of problems with this approach, 3 problems that we focus on. One is that it's simply no longer feasible to anonymize data. So with the increase in publicly available data, the increase in analytical technology and skills, then it's simply impossible now to ensure that data is completely anonymized. And there's been a lot of public proofs of this where supposedly de-identified data has been re-identified. So the proof is there. So de-identifying, anonymizing, we use these terms synonymously, is no longer adequate to protect individual interests. And really all individual level data, unit level data should now be treated as identifiable. The second problem is the adverse impact on the utility of the data. So the more you delete, suppress, generalize, or otherwise perturb a data set, the less useful it becomes to answer research questions. The third problem is probably the most serious or the most fundamental, in that anonymizing data, de-identifying data only addresses one small ethical problem, well not small, but only one ethical problem when there are many other ethical problems that need to be addressed. So it only addresses the privacy of the individual participants. Firstly, there are a lot of other concerns for the participants, but most importantly, the research affects other people other than the participants. So the outcomes can be used to make predictions and decisions based on the shared characteristics identified in the research. So there's the risks of overgeneralization, of profiling, discrimination, stigmatization. All those risks apply to a much wider group than the actual participants in the research. So it's those group interests that need to be considered as well, and which simply anonymizing the data doesn't address in any way at all. The law uses the concept of personal information, which is generally defined as information which is reasonably identifiable. And the law uses that concept to draw a hard line between when the legal regimes apply and when they don't. So for example, the privacy legislation only applies if the information is reasonably identifiable. So it's a hard line. If it's one side of the line, the law applies. If it's the other side of the line, the law doesn't apply. Now, as we know, identifiability isn't a hard line, it's a spectrum. And that means that somebody has to make a judgment call about what's reasonably identifiable and what's not. And it depends on the context. It depends on the amount of information, the type of information, and the additional information available to the holder, and the skills and technology available to the holder to re-identify it. This concept of reasonable identifiability is a moving one. So it's moving in a practical sense as there becomes more information available publicly and analytical skills develop, then more and more information is in fact re-identifiable. So that line is shifting in a practical sense because more and more information is becoming re-identifiable. So much so, as I say, I think we now need to regard all unit level data as identifiable. In addition to that, the legal interpretation of this concept is also moving. So in some recent determinations by the Office of the Australian Privacy Commissioner, the determination has conflated identifiability with distinguishability, and this is a significant development. So what's been said is that information is identifiable if an individual is uniquely distinguishable from all other individuals in the respondent's data set. Uniquely distinguishable. Seems to me that that would include all individual level data and certainly all linked data. So if that's the case, then one should assume that all linked data is now caught by the privacy legislation, and that would be a significant move. We'll see how that evolves. It's early days. So the bottom line here is with de-identification, it's still vitally important. It does minimise the risks to individuals who are the participants, and perhaps more importantly, it's also still crucial to maintain community support for linked data research. But it doesn't solve all the legal and ethical problems. So we do need to go beyond that and focus on approval, authorisation and approval. And this is the focus of our book. So when we're talking about authorisation, we're talking about the fact that it is lawful to release and use the data for research without consent. So this is a may. It may be done. So in the book, in chapter 5, we examine the current law in the United Kingdom, in Canada, and in Australia, and we identify the problems and gaps. Now, there's been a lot of law reform in the area, but there are still significant problems. It's still complex, there are still overlapping statutes, and there's still overlap with the common law. There's still different treatment of different kinds of data and different kinds of research, which is logically indefensible. And there are still some kinds of data which simply cannot be accessed lawfully. As I say, there has been a lot of law reform and it's ongoing. In Australia, recently, this year, we have the Commonwealth enacting the Data Availability and Transparency Act. This has been touted as providing an alternative path for the lawful release of data for research. Unfortunately, in my reading of it, I think it fails this aim because it excludes all confidential data from this approval pathway and this authorisation pathway. And that's pretty much all the data that you're going to be interested in. All of it is collected in confidential circumstances. Most of it is anyway. So we still haven't got it quite right. There's still work to be done. And in chapter 5, we conclude with our recommendations in relation to law reform and describe our model of what we think the structure of the law should be and the essential provisions in the legislation which is needed. So once you get the it may be released, then you still need somebody to make a decision in any particular case whether or not it should be released. So this is about the approval processes. Now, what we're talking about here is using the coercive authority of the state to override individual autonomy about the use and disclosure of personal information, private information about themselves. So it's important that it's both moral legitimacy, moral justification, as well as political justification. And there's 2 points I'd like to emphasize here in relation to this. The first is that it's essential that all the relevant interests and competing rights are considered. As Carolyn has discussed, that's been less than perfect in the past. In the past, there's been a bit of a tendency to see it as a simple dichotomy between individual privacy on the one hand and the benefits of the health research on the other hand. That's not adequate. We need to expand that and make sure that all the interests are considered, both individual and collective. The second point is that decisions need to reflect community norms about privacy. Now, when I'm talking about community norms about privacy, it's the norms about what's kept secret, but it's also the norms about what is shared and how it's shared. And this is an incredibly complex area in our society at the moment because those norms are shifting so rapidly and they're pulling in different directions. So keeping a handle on what the community thinks is normal and approves of at the moment is really tricky. So community norms in a way is another way of talking about social license. So what does the community accept and support in terms of the use of individual information for research without their consent? In chapter 3, we analysed the qualitative evidence of social licence and identify the conditions under which it is acceptable to the community to use their information in this way. And then we go on to consider the implications for that in relation to the approval processes that are adopted. It's important to remember that social licence isn't about a marketing exercise to persuade people that they should support it. It's about reflecting existing views of the community. And now I'm going to hand on to Felicity, who's going to pick up and talk some more about the approval processes that we think need to be considered and the aspects of that.
Thanks, Judy. Do you want to stop sharing?
I'll try. Why isn't that working?
I think that's working now.
Is that right?
I think so. I'll see if I can share. Not quite yet. Oh no, you still haven't stopped sharing.
Ah, there we go.
Found it? Brilliant. Thank you. Excellent. Now let's see if I can share. All right. I think we're there. Okay, great. Just moving across there. So thank you very much to Carolyn and Judy. And I'm going to talk to you about part 3 of the book. So Carolyn and Judy have described the range of interests that need to be taken into account in whether to share linked data or not, and touched on some of the reasons why current approaches to protecting these interests may not be fit for purpose. So I'm going to talk about part 3 of the book, which is chapters 7 and 8, and where we looked at decisions and the process and practice of decision making. What decisions need to be made, how are these decisions made, and who makes these decisions. In the book, we use examples from Scotland, Manitoba, and Australia. And we've also done some previous work, which Carolyn touched on Australian practices, which I'm also going to reference. But first of all, let's have a think about what decisions need to be made when we're wanting to share linked data for research. So most people, I think, here today will be familiar with the last decision in this chain. Should linked data be shared for this particular research project? And I'm sure that many of you have very strong opinions about who and how this decision should be made. However, we shouldn't forget that there are also other decisions that have to be made as well, particularly in the context of routine and enduring linkage and the establishment and use of large linked data assets. And these other decisions that need to be made are, should this data be linked to other sources in this case, or ever? It could be a threshold question. How should we link the data? What linkage methods should we use? Should we just do it once? Should we be doing it on an enduring basis? And then another that many of you will be very familiar is, where should the linked data be stored and accessed? So there's a range of decisions that need to be made. And in chapter 7, we review existing decision-making processes in 3 different countries, and the criteria that we chose to conduct this review reflected good governance practices, and those good governance practices include efficiency, and efficiency has a number of elements to it, including proportionality, and by that we mean that the process was proportionate to the risks and interests involved. Timeliness, and again, the endless complaint we hear from researchers is about timeliness and the lack of timeliness in these decision-making processes, and also the minimisation of duplication, that we shouldn't be making the same decision again and again, or by different people making the same decision. The next element is transparency, and by transparency we mean that the decision-making criteria and process should be easily accessed and understood by everyone, the people making the decisions and the people requesting the decisions to be made, and also the community more broadly. But also part of transparency is that there should be information about what data is being used and by whom, and that should be easily available in language understood by most people. The next element we took into account was accountability, and this incorporates the fact that the person or the body responsible for the decision should be clearly identified, and that there should be oversight of decision making, and this includes oversight to ensure that issues of bias and conflict of interest are considered, and that there also are avenues for people to raise concerns or complaints about the decision making process. And last but definitely not least, there should be community involvement, that community members should be involved in the decision making and also have opportunities to inform decision makers. So that was sort of our framework for good decision making. So when we think about efficiency, there are a range of things that can affect efficiency in decision making, and one of those things is the number of decision makers. And when we looked at a case study which we applied to the different jurisdictional decision making processes, we found that there can be many decision makers. So this is an example from Australia where if you wanted to link a state registry of births, deaths and marriages to the midwives or perinatal data set and the Australian Immunisation Register, you end up having 5 different decision makers, 3 data custodians and 2 ethics committees. And this certainly has an impact on efficiency. By contrast, when we looked at the Scottish example, if we used the same case study of a childhood vaccination study, the example would likely only require review by 3 government employed information governance practitioners as part of the Public Benefit and Privacy Panel for Health and Social Care. And separate ethics approval may not be required. This approach is undoubtedly more efficient than the Australian approach, but it also has limitations in other areas of decision making. For example, ethical issues, as Judy's alluded to earlier, other than privacy would not be taken into consideration in this kind of approach, and there would be no community involvement in decision making. Another element of efficiency is duplication of review. And in the book, we found this in our comparison of decision-making processes across different countries. For today, I've used an example of some Australian research that we did previously, because I just had the nice table, so it looks good. And this demonstrated, we looked at 3 different Australian jurisdictions and the types of criteria that each jurisdiction required to be taken into consideration when making decisions about whether to share data or not. And we looked at whether the ethics committee or the data custodian were making these decisions against each of these criteria. And what we were able to demonstrate is that there was significant overlap in the areas that both the data custodians and ethics committees were making decisions. In particular, all of the jurisdictions, both the ethics committee and the data custodians, were assessing issues around governance and privacy and confidentiality. So there are clearly opportunities for improvement in decision-making efficiency, particularly in regards to these two areas, the number of decision makers and the minimisation of duplication of review. One of the elements of good governance is transparency, and part of transparency is clear decision-making criteria. And one of the things that we've done in the book is to look at what are sort of the ideal list of decision-making criteria that would take into account all of the wide-ranging interests that we've identified. And in order to do this, we've thought about the interests that need to be taken into account, and we've also reviewed a lot of the criteria that commonly appear in legislation, privacy legislation guidelines and ethics guidelines in the countries that we looked at. Now, many of these criteria that you'll be familiar with, that you may have seen in, for example, the Australian National Statement, so ethics guidelines, or you might have seen them in privacy legislation or guidelines. But some of them are not commonly explicitly stated, and those are the ones particularly around community views and human rights other than privacy. So sort of new additions to the list that you won't be familiar with are things like that the outcomes are valued by the community, that the use of the data is acceptable to the community, and that all human rights have been considered and an appropriate balance of rights has been achieved. It's also worth mentioning that decision makers must take into account all of the relevant considerations. They can't pick and choose which ones they want to consider, and that these considerations should be clear in legislation, policy, or guidelines. And decision makers shouldn't be taking into account irrelevant considerations. For example, whether the research might reflect badly on government policy or programs. I want to finish off by reflecting on who should be making these decisions. And as I've already highlighted, that commonly in current practices, there's often overlap in decision making. And we previously conducted some qualitative research with data custodians across Australia, and they indicated to us a lack of clarity about their role and confusion about what the role of the ethics committee was. And this confusion can result in all decision makers trying to cover every base because they're not sure who's responsible for which decisions. And we definitely think that the roles of the ethics committee and data custodians are distinct. And what we think the roles are is that the ethics committees should be determining whether the project has sufficient merit to warrant human participants and to be protecting the interests of those participants as well as the wider community. Whereas the data custodian is responsible for ensuring that the applicable legal, regulatory and institutional requirements are met in relation to the data collection and the organisation. And this includes standards of quality, safety, risk and financial management. So that's a very quick taste of what's a much longer book, but I'm going to finish there, but not before I do. Oh, that was disappeared very quickly, Nicola. I was going to say a plug for you can purchase the book now, or maybe your university library has already made it available. I know at if you're at the University of Western Australia, where I am, if you go into the Cambridge University website, you can download PDFs of the chapters of the book through the UWA site. So that's really helpful. But we're now really happy to take any questions that the audience might have. I know we've got one to start. So if we get Judy and Carolyn just to pop their cameras back on and their microphones. Good, yay. Welcome back. I'm just fiddling with my computer here. So first question is, what do you think is the most important group that you'd like to read the book, and what do you hope they might action? And first person to put their hands up gets to answer that question. Judy, do you want to have a go?
Yeah, I mean, Carol mentioned this a little in what she said already, but I think the readership is diverse. Clearly, for those who are influencing the authorisation and approval process, which I was talking about, it is very much directed at you. So this would be legislators, people designing a law reform, and also people designing and implementing the approval processes themselves. So that would include the linkage units themselves, plus the data custodians, plus the ethics committees. So all those groups are currently engaged in the approval process. So I think it has a lot to say to all of those groups. But more widely, I think it does just give a framework for anybody who's using linked data to think about some of the issues that maybe you don't generally have time to think about very much, but are the backdrop of what you're doing, and give you a moment to reflect on the implications of what you're doing in the community. Carolyn, did you want to add anything to that?
Just that the material in the book isn't just relevant in Australia. So as mentioned a couple of times during our presentations, there's a fair bit of comparative work in the book done between Australia, Canada and the United Kingdom. So we looked at the legal arrangements in those three jurisdictions, and you know, so we feel like there's probably an international audience for the book as well. And of course, this is going to become increasingly important as we, you know, enable the potential international linkage of data. So consistency of regulatory arrangements is something that we've all probably stumbled over in the data linkage field. Because when you start linking across jurisdictions, even nationally, so between states, the legislation will be different. So you can imagine how that gets much more complicated once you begin linking data internationally. So I suppose one of the aims of the book is to start the discussion about how to introduce more consistency in the regulatory framework to allow those processes to occur.
Next question. Do you discuss the 5 safes framework in the book? I might start that one off. Yes, we do. We do touch on it briefly and relatively lightly, mostly because it's a fairly high-level framework, and most of the 5 safes are very focused on information and data security and approaches to that, secure research environments and those sorts of things. The project principle, I suppose as they're calling it in the DAT these days, is the only one that really goes anywhere close to a consideration of wider interests, I would think. So 5 safes, I think we would argue, is a useful framework when starting to think through how you're going to manage the data for these particular projects, but it's probably doesn't cover the wide range of interests that we're saying need to be covered. Does anyone else want to jump into 5 safes?
Yeah, I mean, I think the particular safe that we think needs a lot more exploration is in relation to how you evaluate the public interest, how you decide whether this project justifies the use of the data. So the others are more straightforward, perhaps, as Felicity said, around the safety of the data, the safety of the people who use it, and so on. But it's that one around what's sometimes called public interest, which is the most challenging and it requires a lot more elaboration than you find in the 5 Safes framework itself. It's a framework, but it needs elaboration.
Next question, how extensible are these concepts and recommendations to health data collected and owned by non-government entities like universities or research institutions who wish to make their data available for secondary use?
So the book, of course, focuses on government data, and that was a deliberate decision we made because at the moment the major collections of interest to researchers are held by government, but some of the work in the book will be extensible. I guess what won't be extensible is that the legislation that governs private and public sectors is different in many jurisdictions, so the legal framework might be slightly different, but a lot of the higher level principles, the human rights principles, the social license principles, the ethical principles will be the same. And so the discussion, I think, in the book, some of that will certainly be relevant to private sector data collections.
One difference which may be significant is that a lot of the data that universities would collect would be collected directly from the participants. So it's research data rather than administrative data. So it's collected directly from research participants in the course of a project. Now, if it's collected directly in that way, then the concept of consent comes right back into focus. So that would be a significant distinction between administrative data and research data. And that, of course, carries on, the implications of that carry on if the data is likely to be used for future projects, then there needs to be thought about that at the time of collection, about what future uses it might have, as well as the immediate project.
Next question. Does the decision-making criteria change in the context of project-specific linkage as opposed to enduring linkage with unknown future applications? No, I don't think the criteria change.
Sorry, could you repeat the question, Felicity? I can't find it there.
Oh, sorry. Does the decision-making criteria change in the context of project-specific linkage as opposed to enduring linkage with unknown future applications? And I think the criteria do not change, but you might make different judgments on some of those criteria because the risks and benefits may be different.
Yeah.
Judy's thinking hard there.
Yeah, I'm thinking hard. I'm trying to think what the community would think about that. So would the community feel the same about enduring linkages as opposed to project-specific linkage? And there may well be some difference there that you could think about exploring.
Oh, I think there would be, but would you change the criteria under which, so if we're saying one of the criteria is community support for the outcomes or whatever.
No, the broad criteria.
I think the decisions made might be different, but I don't think the criteria would be different.
Yeah, I agree with that.
With that? Okay. Okay. Have there been developments in the definition of community? It seems that ethics committees take an exclusion view that community means people who aren't the researchers, data analysts, technology, personnel, etc. But all of these folk are part of the wider community as well.
Yeah, okay. So community, when you're talking about community consultation, obviously one of the big challenges is identifying what community that you're talking about. And this is going to vary a lot from project to project. So some projects, it's really obvious, you know, you're looking at a particular demographic group, you're looking at a particular disease group, you're looking at a particular geographic location, then it's easier to define your community. In terms of groups or collectives, another thing to think about is that there will be pre-existing groups that already self-identify. So they might be ethnicities, they might once again be disease groups. But then the research itself actually creates collectives. So the purpose of the research, generally speaking, is to identify common characteristics. And in doing that, you're creating a new group. So the research outcome itself can create a new group who has common interests and concerns. I don't know whether that addresses it. Am I getting there, Carolyn? Anything you want to add to that?
I suppose in terms of the community that needs sort of our attention and protection. And I think what our book does, though, is to look at all sides of the equation, including the researchers. So I think there was a little subtext in that question that researchers and tech people are outside the decision-making criteria and somehow outside, like getting the thin end of the wedge from the ethics committee decision-making process. But we're very cognizant of the fact that, you know, researchers in this field generally are motivated by, you know, a desire to do good in the community and to do ethical research that's in the public interest. And one of the motivators for us in putting pen to paper and trying to explore these issues was the fact that researchers were finding barriers to access to information, and that everybody's interests need to be considered and weighed in making decisions around the use of linked data. So we're hoping that the book looks at all sides of this decision-making framework and all of the stakeholders who have an interest in the decisions as well.
Now we're really getting to the top of the hour and we've got 3 questions left. So let's try and power through and see if we can get at least some response to all of them. First one is, building on your response about the 5 safes framework, often a range of ethical principles are applied across various organisations, with some adhering to the ethical principles outlined in the national statement, while other organisations have a slightly different focus. What's your view on the merit of considering ethical principles outside the national statement?
Okay, so in chapter, what is it, chapter 4, is it, Felicity? We had a close look at the ethical principles internationally and tried to think about whether they were up to the job. Ultimately, our conclusion was that the 4 core ethical principles that frame the national statements, so research merit, beneficence, I've gone blank. What
justice and respect.
Thank you, Felicity. That they did encompass what needed to be considered, but they needed rejigging a bit. So we felt, for example, that there wasn't adequate consideration of collective interests as opposed to individual interests. So our view was that with a little bit of rethinking and reinterpretation, those core values did do the job. So you don't need to go outside the national statement to encompass all the ethical issues that one should consider, but they do need a little bit of rethought in this context. Do you want to add to that, Felicity?
No, I think that's, given the time, that's a
okay.
Good summary. Quickly, 2 more. So how are decisions made if the study involves participants from multiple ethnicities? I might start. Look, I don't think there's no possible way that any decision-making process you can include, you know, every possible permutation and combination of the kind of person that may be affected by that study. But I do think you need to do the best you can to have as broad a contribution of what the community might think. And there are different ways that you can incorporate community into the decision making and the research itself. So there's not just one way you can do it, and there's not just sort of one kind of people, but if it depends on the case as well. So if you are talking about a specific research project that is particularly looking at a couple of different cultural groups or ethnicities, then clearly you should have both of those represented in some way in the decision making. But if we're talking about population level research, then you just need to take a sort of relatively broad view and inclusion to what's practical. You still have to be practical in your decision making, because remember, one of the other things you have to take into consideration is efficiency. Final question is, what do you think the next 10 years will bring for linked data? Which is...
That one's got your name on it, Felicity.
I think the simple answer is I think we're going to be linking a lot more data, a much wider variety of types of data, so well beyond the administrative data we're talking about in this book, and, you know, into lots of individual, you know, data coming from wearable tech and social media and all sorts of stuff like that. And there are probably a range of other issues that we'll need to cover in our next book. But we're now a few minutes late, so I think it's time for me to say thank you very much to Carolyn and Judy for joining me here today to talk about our book, but also thank you very much to everybody who came along to listen today and to hear about the book, and we're very, very grateful that you've been interested in our work. So I say thank you to everybody and goodbye.